The clerk will report the amendment by number.
The senator from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy, for himself and Mr. Cotton, proposes an amendment numbered 1162 to amendment numbered 891.
I ask unanimous consent for 2 minutes of debate equally divided.
Without objection.
I rise on behalf of myself, Senators Cotton and Cruz. Our amendment prevents $1,400 stimulus checks from going to inmates. You heard that right. This bill sends $1,400 stimulus checks to people incarcerated for heinous crimes. Prisoners have all their living and medical expenses paid for by the taxpayer. They don't pay taxes. They don't contribute to the tax base. They can't be unemployed. In other words, inmates are not economically impacted by COVID, and inmates cannot stimulate the economy. But under this bill, Democrats are giving prisoners, again sometimes incarcerated for heinous crimes, a $1,400 stimulus check. If we eliminate these, we save taxpayers $1.9 billion. Now, I know my Democratic colleagues aren't going to agree, but this spending should be on real needs. Stimulus checks for inmates is non-targeted, inappropriate. It is a total waste of money. I ask my colleagues to support the amendment.
Mr. President.
The senator for Illinois.
Mr. President, this amendment will cause harm to the families of incarcerated individuals. Joint filers who would receive only half of the payment that their families are owed while the spouse is incarcerated. Given the stark racial disparities in our criminal justice system, this would cause the most harm to black and brown families in communities already harmed by mass incarceration. Children should not be forced to go hungry because a parent is incarcerated. Relief payments would allow families to replace lost income and pay rent and put food on the table. The Cassidy amendment sweeps broadly, denying recovery rebates not only to incarcerated individuals, but also to anyone violating a condition of probation or parole. But the Social Security statute that Senator Cassidy's amendment copies from has a safety valve, giving discretion to allow payments to persons because of mitigating circumstances. His amendment does not. I would urge my colleagues to understand what we're facing with our criminal justice system today. We need to bring more justice to it and caring for the families of those who are incarcerated.
I'll reply, it only applies to people incarcerated for a year. That's not true. I call for the vote.
The questions on the amendment? Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Haggerty. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr.